Congresswoman Melanie Stansbury. I'm so excited to have you here. I really appreciate you making time. I've obviously learned quite a bit about you the past several weeks, and not only am I very interested in your story, but I honestly just felt like you seemed like the type of person that'd be fun to hang out with at a backyard barbecue. So I appreciate you being here.
Well, I dressed for the occasion.
You very much did. I love it. So kind of before we start diving into things, I think, one thing I'm curious about, I think probably the first time a lot of people saw you or had exposure to you was a few months ago. It was the president's address to Congress, and you were, very famously photographed and holding up a handwritten sign that said, "This is not normal." And I'm just curious, how did that come about? Was that something you talked about beforehand, or was it something where you're like, this is all pretty crazy, I'm going to write this down and see if I can go stand next to him?
Well, okay. So the backstory of how that sign came to be is kind of a meandering story, but let me just say this, that I've worked in the federal government. During the Obama administration, I worked here in D.C. I worked at the Office of Management and Budget and the Council on Environmental Quality. I was a Hill rep for a while, and then I moved home to New Mexico and served in the state legislature. But as a Fed, you learn all the rules and laws of what's normal and how the government operates. And so immediately, aside from the fact that I think Donald Trump is a very dangerous individual before he was even reelected, it was very obvious from day one when you saw Elon Musk sitting in a crowd in the rotunda in the Capitol, right, that this was not going to be a normal administration. Then they had that crazy rally downtown at the hockey stadium where Trump was, signing executive orders and had no idea what he was even signing. So literally from day one, it was not normal.
Yeah.
And then Doge launched, and within a week or two, I was named as the highest ranking Democrat. And part of why I took up the banner of the fight against Doge is that I could tell, one, that Elon Musk was a total bullshit artist. He had no idea what he was talking about. Two, it was very clear that they didn't plan to execute any of this within the boundaries of the law. And three, it was clear they had no idea what they were doing. And so, and now as an elected representative, I was going home and people are totally freaked out. And the Friday before the president addressed Congress was that Oval Office interview, what would you even call it, with Zelensky, right? And if you recall, the media was going crazy and leaders all over the world were having emergency meetings because they were what is going on? Is the president of the United States now allies with Russia and not allies with Europe, right? This is upside down world. And so as we headed into the joint address, there were all these discussions amongst Democrats about how do we respond. And I think there wasn't a clear and unified response at that point, because some people were we need to be shouting to the world that something's really wrong here. I think others who are maybe more reserved in just how they approach things thought, we'll show up but not say anything.
Yeah.
And then people had all these different ideas. And so I showed up the morning of, and you can't actually sit on the aisle unless you hold seats. It's kind of like Hunger Games. You got to go down there.
You got to stake your, like a pool or a pool chair on a summer day in a place.
It got very aggressive during the day because the Freedom Caucus, they were also holding seats and they were trying to encroach into the Democratic side of the aisle, and it was straight up high school. People were moving people's stuff and moving people's signs. And so I was just holding seats for Democrats in general, and so I had saved a bunch of aisle seats. And anyway, long story short, people had all different ideas of what they were going to do. And literally, I went to go get some food. I was walking back to the floor and I was I'm going to make a sign. And I went into the cloakroom, which is the lounge off the floor, and I grabbed a marker and I just said, this is not normal. And I didn't really have a plan at that point.
I love it.
Yeah. And I was sitting next to Jasmine Crockett, who's a dear, dear friend. And I showed her my sign and I was like, what do you think? I was like, should I hold this up? And I've been to a lot of presidential addresses, so you know that on the aisle seat, you're going to be in the line of view. And she kind of gave me a little bit of a look and I was like, okay, we'll see how this goes. And so as the president walked in, it was kind of funny because I wasn't actually facing the cameras at the point that he looked at me and we locked eyes for a minute. And I could tell he was really irritated. He was like, who is this clown? Why is this lady ruining my moment?
Yeah, she's ruining my photo op.
And Marjorie Taylor Greene was opposite on the other side of the aisle. And as everyone turned around, there was a whole gaggle of press right there. And I don't know, I think it was an AP photographer just happened to be at just the right angle where you could see my sign and like capture the whole scene. And I say it's the picture that was heard around the world, because the thing that was amazing is that it was not only the cover of like the Washington Post, it was like the cover of the Singaporean paper, the Paris newspaper, I think Berlin, because it resonated for people.
I think what's interesting, and you know, we'll move through and we'll talk about your background, your career, and all this, but something, I guess, even to piggyback off this that I'm curious. I think something that why that photo resonated so much. I remember from that night there were other signs, but it was very clear that there had been this like overwhelming amount of thought put into like, we need to print these signs and give them out to people. And I think there was a level of just like, you know, an organic approach to the way you did it. It sounds like you did it in the moment. And I think that clearly is something that clicked with people, where I think people maybe saw other things from that night and just felt like it didn't connect with them. And I think you kind of doing that in the moment, and this, you know, clarity that it was this handwritten sign that had kind of just been put together, I think is what worked. And I think something that I've found interesting too, as I've gotten to know you the past few weeks and looked through stuff, I think you take this approach, I'd say, to social media that is different than what I see a lot of people do. I think I've on your Facebook every day, you do these updates for your constituents about what's happening that week and what you're concerned about, and you're getting 15 and 20 and 20,000 likes just on kind of these Facebook update videos. But I think in this era of very performative politics, like how do you see yourself as using these platforms to connect in a more authentic way?
Yeah, I mean, actually, what I see my role as primarily, in addition to obviously representing my district and fighting for the people of New Mexico, is being an educator. And I think the American people are hungry to understand the process and are paying attention to politics and like our democratic institutions in a way that they never have. And they're, because like the game was always big media, and to get into big media, you had to have big money and to have high stature inside of politics. The real revolution of social media is that it democratizes information. And, I'm in my late 40s. I'm by no means like a native social media user, but what I do know is that the only time I have in the day is like few moments in between things. And when I first started like uploading short educational videos about what was happening in the process in real time, like that's when we started to get a huge response. And, I'm a huge fan of how AOC communicates. I think she's an extremely effective communicator. But personally, like her long form Instagram lives are, they're amazing, but they're sometimes like 45 minutes or an hour. And then like, unless you've got time to listen, it's kind of hard to like get the full picture. So I'm trying to like distill these really complex things into 3-minute quips so that people can really understand what's going on.
I think there's something that people, I think too, just inherently like about you. I'm in an airport terminal and I've got 5 minutes because I'm on the go, but I still feel this like urgency to let people know what's going on. And so, for anybody out there looking for effective ways to communicate, I truly have enjoyed kind of just seeing the stuff you put out. So I think it's great. I guess to rewind a little bit and kind of take it back to your upbringing and your childhood. You were raised in Albuquerque, New Mexico by a single mom. I've seen so much that you've posted and talk about how impactful she was on your life. And I'd just love for you to talk about her a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, probably part of why my mom's on my mind a lot, aside from the fact that we were really close, is I lost her last October. And so, I'm still kind of in the grieving process. And my sister and I are still, trying to figure out how to sort through her amazing treasures that she spent her life accumulating. But, I think like so many Americans, my family is like a very humble people. My mom, it's been, I don't know if you've lost someone you're really close to or not, but it's like when you do, people start telling you stories, right? And one of the things that's also interesting is when you run for office, you have to learn how to tell your own story. And there were a lot of things about my childhood that actually I felt ashamed of because we grew up very low income. Like I never, ever professionally, I was always felt like, especially because I worked here in Washington, like you have to put on like a perfect face, right? Like and show up and do your best. And so I never talked about growing up poor or, being on government assistance or housing or things like that until I decided to run for office. And then I realized that actually it's really powerful if you have that story, not only because it drives the policy making and the things that you prioritize and the things that you care about and are willing to fight for, but because it's this power to connect with people with your own lived experience, which frankly, the human experience is hard no matter what your background is. So, I think about my mom of like, she was not in politics with a capital P. My mom was just a seamstress.
Yeah.
And but she was a small businesswoman. She owned her own sewing shop. She did lots of different kinds of contract sewing. So I grew up like sewing buttons. And my mom worked in the theater as a costumer for years. Okay. And she worked at a Levi's factory and she made puppets. I mean, she was just this like creative font, constantly creating and sewing. But she always really struggled to make ends meet. And so we had a lot of like adverse experiences across my childhood. And so, like in retrospect, I really have come to see like my mother is this like, she was always this stabilizing force, but also she was such a badass.
Yeah, exactly. That's what really came through for me too. It just like grit and perseverance. And I mean, look where you are and that's a result of what she's done. I mean, I think it's great when you get to a point where you've gotten, I'm sure you feel like the things that you probably used to be ashamed of, you probably wear as a badge of honor now. Yeah. I guess I'm also curious for you've talked about growing up with housing insecurity or food insecurity. When that's happening when you're a younger kid, I think parents obviously as much as they can try to shield their kids from that. But I'm curious for you, were you conscious of it and aware of it growing up? And when that's happening, where did you feel like the frustration was directed at that? Was it directed at the government? Was it directed or was it just kind of, this is the situation and we're powering through it?
I think and I think this is why, for me, storytelling of your own personal story becomes really important. And when I hear other members of Congress and public officials, is like, I think our story was probably more common than most people's. More common than you would think. Yeah. But often not heard in like the spheres of power. I'll tell you, when I first came to Washington in 2010 to be an intern. I was like a mid-career intern. I was a graduate student at the time. And I got a job in the Obama White House working at the Council on Environmental Quality as an intern. And then I took a job at OMB. And I'll never forget my first day on the job at OMB. I worked in the Interior branch, and there were about 6 or 8 staff members, and OMB is where the budget gets put together. And they were discussing a housing program that in order to hit budgetary targets, they were going to zero out. And I remember the examiner at the time saying, oh, it's just a $10 million program. And I just remember like sitting there at this table and I was like, oh, this person who I adore now as a colleague doesn't have the lived life experience of knowing how a housing voucher would change the life. And how much $10 million can do. Right, exactly. But if you've never lived that life where you're a paycheck away from being homeless, or, in the case of my family, my parents split up and my mom broke her leg and lost her job for a while, and we ended up sleeping in a tent for a summer in a family friend's backyard. And I think was I middle school, elementary school? I can't even remember. I mean, I was embarrassed, right? Like, I went to school wearing the same clothes every day. Kids would make fun of me. So I was very, very conscious of it. Kids were having pool parties and I was living in a tent. So,
Well,
yeah.
and for you, was that, because I know, you when you went to school, you studied development ecology and developmental sociology. Was that something that you were like, it seems like you were curious about that, about kind of learning about how societies change and how these systems work and like how they leave people behind too, and hopefully how to not do that.
Yeah. I mean, I think like humans are complex, right? And I think that's one of the beautiful things about like telling our stories as well is like, yeah, I grew up in a low income background, but even though I was conscious of it, it was never identity defining for me ever. It literally wasn't. Like, I was a nerdy science kid. I was like doing weird science fair experiments at home. And
you were winning the science fair in middle school, yeah?
No, I won the state science fair in the 8th grade.
State science fair, okay.
I did. I actually, hair flip. I won the state science fair for a water quality monitoring project where I busted one of our sewage treatment plants for violating their pollution permit.
No way. Okay.
I did. Yeah.
Wait, so I know water is like one of these kind of defining characteristics. Water management, all of that is one of these kind of defining characteristics of the Southwest and the American West. What do you think people misunderstand about it, and what can be done about it?
Yeah. Well, so actually this all ties together. So my interest was always like secretly in the sciences, or maybe not so secretly since I was a science kid. But so I got a scholarship to go to college, and I did my undergrad in ecology and earth science. And I tried my best when I moved home to New Mexico to get a job. Like, I really wanted to work in conservation or doing some sort of environmental management. And I ended up getting a job as an educator at the Museum of Natural History. And I worked with kids all over the state of New Mexico. And it was through that job teaching middle schoolers and high schoolers across the state. And I often say it was like my best preparation for politics, working with middle schoolers. Although middle schoolers are much more well-behaved than politicians. But it's something that I already knew, but like in the Southwest in particular, water is culture, water is life, water is tied to our livelihoods, it's tied to our sustainability, it's tied to culture, language. And as I traveled the state and worked in communities, that's what got me curious about policy and politics, because everywhere I went, kids would say, well, why do we manage water this way if it doesn't make sense for these reasons? And so I went back to school to study sociology, focused on natural resources and water rights issues. And I think one of the things that maybe people misunderstand, and actually my graduate research was heavily focused on, is that our connection to the natural world is also cultural, right? And that's something people experience in places like New Mexico. But if you're living in a big city on the East Coast, you might not have that same connection to place, or you have it to your neighborhood, but maybe you don't have it to like water as a part of life. And so I think that's something that maybe people don't understand, that the long-term survival and resilience of like the desert isn't just like, how are people going to get water to keep the economy going in places like New Mexico? It's like literally there are cultures that have been there for thousands of years, and protecting water is about protecting those cultures. Okay. And so that's why I ended up going and doing a degree focused in sociology and natural resources. But also it's like integral, and this is where it ties back to my own story, is like I feel like I've always been on a lifelong quest to understand a really fundamental question, which is why in a country or a place like New Mexico that's so rich and like beauty and natural abundance and natural resources and culture and people, like, do people struggle so much? And that's how I got interested ultimately in policy and politics, and what ultimately called me to run for office.
Well, yeah, I guess I'm curious. So you've talked about your career up until running for office. You run for the Mexico State House seat, and you spend 2.5 years there, and then eventually, Deb Haaland becomes the Secretary of the Interior, and you end up running for her seat. I'm curious from from that run for Congress? I know it was kind of scrappy, and what was what was a lesson you learned from that run for Congress, and kind of how did you bring that lesson to DC with you after you won?
So my story actually, it's kind of one continuous story from the moment I packed up my car and left DC in 2017. So I was living here in Adams Morgan, working on the Hill. I was a water staffer on the Energy Committee. In 2016, Donald Trump got elected, and I had come to DC thinking that I'd be here for a 6-month internship and stayed for 7 years. And I was already kind of getting to a point, even though like I had an amazing community here, and I love living in DC, especially under the Trump administration in those early years. That was the first year where it was like every day people were leaving and moving, and it felt dark and ominous, kind of like it does now. And I wanted to go home and be close to my family. I wanted to help take care of my mom. And I lived just up the road here in Adams Morgan. I packed up my car. Anything that didn't fit in my car was put on the curb because I was never coming back. And I got in my car and I drove across the United States, and I took this epic camping trip with one of my best friends. And literally the day after I got to Albuquerque, a woman in my neighborhood heard that I lived in Washington, D.C., and she invited me to lunch and said, "Hey, we're looking for somebody to run for the state house. Will you run to be our state house rep?" And I was like, what?
So like a bit of just like serendipity in a way. You end up in the neighborhood and this woman says...
Well, I had done a program called Emerge, which is a women's leadership program. And they recruit and help women run for office. And so my name was kind of like in that mix. Yeah. And I had done Emerge in New Mexico, even though I was living here. So I ran in the 2018 cycle. I'd never run for office before. Even though I lived and worked in DC, I was a science staffer. I was not I was not in the politics world. In fact, the only campaigning I had ever done is my sister was a judge, and I had helped with her campaign, and I had like phone banked and knocked doors for Hillary, right? So I had no idea what I was getting into. So in 2018, I ran for this seat that had never had a Democrat representing it. There were more Republicans registered in that district than Democrats. And like politicos in New Mexico were like, this is not a winnable seat. You're crazy. But I actually used my sociology background. I had taken social statistics. I downloaded the voter data and the census data. And what I saw in the data, I use science.
I love that. We love numbers-driven people.
Yes. Was that demographically, that district was a tale of two cities. It was like you had the upper income folks who were voting reliably, but tending to vote more conservatively. And then a huge proportion of the population that was lower income and communities of color and immigrant communities that was not voting. And so my theory of the case was if we did really amazing outreach to the community, that if we could mobilize numbers of people, we could flip the district. And people told me it was crazy. In fact, I tried to hire a campaign manager for 6 months, and not a single campaign manager would take my race because they were like, that is not a winnable race. So come election night 2018, I literally was one of the first races called in the entire state because not only did I win, I won by 7 points. And it was the biggest political upset in the state. And the newspaper asked me the next day, well, how'd you do it? And just to give you a sense, not only did we use science and data really smartly, but we had this amazing field operation. We had over 300 volunteers just with my district out knocking the doors constantly.
Especially for a state house seat is amazing.
And so, the statewide average that year for a state house race was around 10 or 11,000 knocks and calls, and we did almost 40,000. Wow. And, I thought about at the time writing a book called Threshold because I had spent a year of my life meeting people at their threshold. Our country was at a threshold. Politics was as a threshold. And people are like, how did you do it? There was some secret sauce that I used. And it was literally that we just met people where they were at and listened to them and asked them what they cared about. and built a campaign that people could believe in. And so I had just run for re-election in 2020 because there was a 2-year cycle. It was the height of COVID, if you remember. We were like virtual campaigning, and I was exhausted as hell. It was November, and like 2 weeks after the election, I got a phone call, and they were like, hey, we think Deb is going to be potentially nominated to be the next Congress or the next cabinet secretary for Interior. Would you run for her seat? And I was like,
Again?
I was like, oh, we just ran this crazy race under COVID. And honestly, I took a couple weeks because I was like, I don't know if I have the energy for that. But for me, there were a couple of reasons that I felt like it was important to run. I mean, one, obviously, like, I think there was so much momentum coming off of 2018, especially. That was the first election after Trump. And I was part of the first class in our state legislature where there was a female majority in the Democratic Party, and the first class of like truly progressive legislators. And I had been highly effective in like passing bipartisan legislation and organizing. And like, I really felt like we had built this grassroots movement that was about building a politics that people could actually believe in. And so your question, which I know you asked a while ago, of
No,
like, what did I learn
invested.
on the campaign trail, is that like, I think, you know, right now, especially while Democrats are in the wilderness, if you will, like everyone's trying to figure out like, what's the best podcast I can go on, and what's my messaging that I can pull. And like, I go back to the lesson that I learned in the 2018 cycle. We have to meet people at their threshold.
Can I ask you a question about that? Because I think there is this like question, Democrats are out of power. There's this soul searching moment. People are trying to figure out what is next. What do you think the party needs to stop talking about and start doing? even because I think that is that, you know, Democrats can get tagged with that. They're all talk and they're no action, and it's a little harder when you control none of the levers of power at the moment. But even within that, you know, reality, what do they need to start doing and stop talking about?
I love that you asked this question, because to me, it's all about the doing. Right? Like Michelle Obama said it, do something. I do think postmortems are important. I mean, you know, I come out of the science world. Let's look at the data. Let's look at what happened. But I was on the campaign trail this last year. I traveled to 14 states. I personally knocked, I think, over, I don't even know. We knocked thousands of doors, including in swing districts and frontline districts. I was on the campaign trail for Harris. And like, one of the things that nobody's talking about in this postmortem is like, forget about the message. Like, we didn't even have the basics in place. Like, I went to North Carolina after we realized it might be in play. And like, I was driving to Western North Carolina, and like 4 hours into this drive, and got a call that was like, can you turn around and go the opposite direction because we had the wrong date, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, no, we're too far. And I got there, and there was no infrastructure on the ground in counties that were actually winnable. Right? The county party had really good infrastructure, and the motivation was off the charts, but we didn't have canvassers. We didn't have like infrastructure in the field. I went to Arizona in October, and they didn't have field offices open before noon in Arizona. And I was like, literally, I was like, like, you cannot win in a battleground.
Some people are out the door and gone for the day by noon.
Right? Exactly. And so like, I don't know why we aren't talking about that. Like, we were months behind in like hiring field staff. By the time Kamala was on the ticket, it was already late August, right after the convention, that we really mobilized. And like, to me, if you look at the data, like what she did in 100 days is extraordinary. She shattered every fundraising record, like the mobilization. And I genuinely believe that if we had had another 100 days, she would have won. I really do believe that, because like, she came so close. Like, yeah, the president's trying to claim some crazy mandate because he did win the Electoral College in swing states, but the actual popular vote was extraordinarily close, right? Like, it's 1%. So there's that. So I think like something that we should be talking about that we're not is like, let's get back to basics. Like, politics is not rocket science.
Yeah.
Like, politics is this. It's me and you having a conversation. How do we fix things that are broken? How do we achieve the dreams and hopes that we have for our country and our society?
I think there's also this, it feels like we're in this moment where there's a changing the guard and a sea change, and new faces are popping up. And I'm curious, I mean, something I know, within Washington, even when it comes to committee assignments and things like that, where people get, that's where they get to cut their teeth and get a little more recognition and lead things. I know something Republicans do. I think they have like 6-year term limits, for example, for ranking members on committees. Is that something that you think that would be helpful for Democrats to adopt? So in order to kind of shift new faces into the door as well.
I think like the longer any system in politics that rewards money or seniority begets, I think, entrenchment and can foster, in the wrong hands, corruption.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that in this specific case, but what I think happens in DC, like look at the Senate, for example. You got 90-year-olds serving in the Senate because you can't be a chairperson on a committee until you've served now like 40 years of your life. Like, that's insane. That's mental. But what I will say is that, like, I think American society was already having a generational shift. Like, I'm a late Gen Xer, and like the baby boomer generation was already coming to retirement age and starting to hand over the reins to my generation and millennials. And that's happening in every sector, including in politics, right?
Yeah.
But the challenge is that Democrats in the House and it's the same in the Senate, we don't have, even within our own organizational rules that have term limits on how you are able to exercise leadership within the party and within the institution. And so if you look at the generational change, you have these extraordinarily talented younger people, which we're all in our 40s, right? So we're not like young, fresh talent off the road.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, people like Robert Garcia, like Jasmine Crockett, like AOC, like Sarah Jacobs, that are these just, like you just watch them and you're like, this is amazing. But the system favors seniority and longevity. And so I think there's been discussion within the House caucus of rules change, but the members themselves have to vote for the rules change.
There's a bit of selflessness that has to come into play as well, and I know that can be difficult. And I think it's something I hope that there's more serious discussion about. I mean, I know we're you have a busy schedule and all of that. And I'm definitely conscious of it. So I mean, a couple more questions, and then we can wrap up. I guess quickly. I mean, something I was intrigued by was you were asked about a relationship with Marjorie Taylor Greene, and you'd said actually, like, from what you'd found, she was surprisingly pleasant, normal when the cameras were turned off, and I think there's this interesting question within Washington of people who are kind of one way on camera and another way off, and I'm curious, like, when those things happen, what stops you or anyone, or are you stopped from ever pulling people aside and just being like, what the hell? And in private being like, can we behave the same way in private that we behave in public? And I'm curious if you've been able to do that, if there is a culture of that, or if it's more of like a culture of avoidance of direct conflict, I guess, even behind closed doors to call some of that stuff out.
Yeah, I mean, I call it performance artistry because it's like, it really clearly is in the case of some members. But I would say, like, the ecosystem's a bit more complex. Like, I have always tried to do bipartisan lawmaking, and like, I'm always trying to, my end goal always is, how do I fight for the people of New Mexico and for the American people and to move our country forward? And so, like, even if I disagree with everything else that you believe, but we can find an alliance on an issue that will help the American people, like, I'm all for that. And I think that sometimes in politics, people have a hard time, like, deconstructing that barrier because it's like, well, I can't work with that person because I disagree with their politics. But I kind of look at it from a very human perspective. Like, we all have family members or friends where it's like, you're at a barbecue and you're like, okay, we're not going to talk about politics because it's going to get weird. But like when you're on the Hill, you talk about politics all day. So like a person that you might otherwise find perfectly delightful, you're like, oh God, like, please, no, I don't want to hear this. But I always try to like approach things from a very practical standpoint. And I think most Americans feel that way about politics. Like people are always asking, how do we end polarization? And again, it's like not rocket science. We just have to talk to each other.
I think it's like this curiosity of genuinely wanting to understand how people think without wanting to like rip their heads off at the end of it. Like sometimes it is curious, like what is your thought process that got you to this opinion 100%. In the first place? And I think like, and those conversations can yield really interesting results and really interesting compromises without it exploding into, you know, a million pieces. I one more and we're gonna let you go and I
can I say one thing,
please
though,
do. Yeah.
To pull the veil back a little bit, I think one thing that many Americans would be surprised to hear is that there is a level of collegiality amongst all members. Good. And like when you're on the floor, I call it being in the soup together. Mm-hmm. Like, you know, there's 435 of us, and like whether you like it or not, like even my boyfriend was saying this to me last night. He was like, these are your coworkers. And I'm like, yeah, I literally share a desk with Marjorie Taylor Greene. Like we sit at a dais together for hours. She's my coworker, right? And people don't really think about that. Like we all have coworkers that like, we're like, whoa, when they talk at the office meeting, we're like...
I think it's a good way to phrase it too. It's like, obviously there's a lot of adversarial stuff that's going on in the day-to-day, but you're right. Thinking of them as coworkers does lend a little bit of like, we are doing this together and we're in this together and we're not always going to agree, but like we're still working together at the end of the day.
But beyond that, I mean, a lot of people talk about how members of Congress not living in Washington has really changed the dynamics. And also like a lot of international travel, codels are a good way that you form bonds and relationships with people. But one of my favorite sort of behind the scenes facts about Congress is that there was no space for women off the floor until the 90s. Because there were so few women serving in Congress. And a group of women petitioned the speaker in the 90s to have their own space and restroom off the floor. And so...
Can't believe it took till the 90s?
Yeah, they were given a closet space off of the old House floor. And so there's a bipartisan women's lounge. And you have all these like kind of surreal moments in the lounge because it's just members, right? And there's actually like a back room that where you can go and take your shoes off and put your feet up. And like the other night, I think it was during the second all-nighter on the reconciliation bill, just to protect identities. I'll just say somebody who is very much on the opposite side of the aisle came into the room, and I was sort of like doing some work on my iPad, and she's like, is anyone lying here? And she like literally took a nap next to me. And I'm like, these are the moments the American people don't see, right?
And wish they knew more about, honestly. I think if I took 5 guesses of who it would be, I might get it right. But I think that is the stuff people wish they knew more about, where like it's like there is this performative aspect, and so it's this belief that like that's got to be what's happening 100% of the time. And I think it is good to hear that someone who probably has a very different set of opinions that you do can still come down, take a nap next to you, and 100%. Have it be all good.
And I was like, are they telling you what the schedule is? And she's like, yeah, I just talked to the speaker. He told me XYZ, right? Like you would never expect that when the cameras are on, but like here they are taking a nap.
Okay, one more question before I let you go. You have been in DC for 4 years now. I'm in Congress for 4 years now. What is one moment from the past 4 years, big or small, where you've said, okay, this is why I'm here and this is why I'm doing it?
I think that I have those moments often, maybe less so right now. Although, no, I want to be honest, like in some ways, strangely, like when I took the job that I took at OMB in 2011, it was kind of like out of curiosity because I knew OMB was this sort of black box that had a powerful role in how government works, but nobody really knows what it does. And so even at the time, I was like, this is a reconnaissance mission. I'm going into the belly of the beast. But I love that job. I love the people I worked with, and I really learned how government worked. But I never would have imagined that it would strangely equip me for this specific time when you have an administration that's trying to dismantle everything that's breaking the law and, just acting with absolute, abandon. So in some ways, like I have such a strong sense of purpose every day when I wake up. Like I feel like I'm in a warrior mode for our country. But the things that actually make me feel like this job is worth it, because it is a hard job, especially with the travel and the hours and all of that, is when you actually deliver things for people. And I can say that, like, since I've been in office, we've had 3 rounds of community funded projects, and we've built like some of the, we built a sobering center in Albuquerque to help people who are struggling with addiction so they can get inpatient care. We helped build a veterans housing, transitional housing campus for veterans experiencing homelessness, and like hearing the stories of the veterans that are staying there and how their lives have been transformed by that center. We work with Healthcare for the Homeless that provides free healthcare for the community. Like those are the moments where you're like, okay, the work that we're doing is literally transforming lives.
I love to hear it. Yeah, sometimes it's the stuff that you're doing that even when you're down, that ends up having the greatest impact. Melanie Stansbury from New Mexico's 1st District, thank you so much for coming on Building the Bench. You are welcome back anytime, and our door is always open.
Well, I look forward to it. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.